My talk is called The Jig is Up, and I think the way that I would frame it is as a challenge for all of you. But I think probably the best way to start off a challenge is with a funny picture of myself from college. This was the year 2004. This is me running through an unidentified field. And at this time in my life, I was just finally figuring out what to do at Harvard. I was born in Mexico City. I grew up in a little tiny town in rural Washington State. And Harvard was a really, really weird place. When I got there, I was living in a place called Kirkland House. And there was another guy living in a place called Kirkland House named Mark Zuckerberg. And in the spring of my senior year of college, he launched a thing called the Facebook. I mention this because I think it's worth reflecting on the ridiculous trajectory of social networking. Like if you go back 8 years and you go back to that launch, and you go back to every single student at that college wanting to be on that network within like the first week. I mean, by week 2, people were already saying like, oh, I'm not on the Facebook. Nah, it's not for me. I'm past it, kind of, you know? You saw that trajectory over and over and over in every college in America and then all these other places, and now bordering on like 1 billion people. But if you go back and you think about what we really had back then, it's pretty incredible. This was the most popular phone of 2004. Does anyone remember the Motorola Razr? The clamshell, and I love Steve Jurvetson. I mean, made of various metal alloys. It seems like a fine fashion accessory to the PowerBook. And this is really what we had. You know, people weren't using their phones in the way that we use them now. I mean, the stats I was able to find is about a quarter of people were texting in 2004. Maybe even among the youngest cohort, it was only like 50% of people were texting. We're not talking data, we're not talking Twitter, we're talking nothing. People use their phones to talk on them in 2004, by and large. This was what most computing looked like for people. I mean, it wasn't actually until 2009 that laptops outsold desktops in the United States. 2009. So for a lot of people, computing was basically like a big box attached to like a big monitor. And maybe you had a laptop and it might have looked like that in 2004. So this was a world that was really just waking up to the idea of mobile computing, of like taking computing with you, right? I mean, even in terms of what the laptops look like, I mean, you needed like special orthopedic bags to carry these things around. So when you think about what happened, it's pretty amazing. And it took a pretty ridiculously ambitious vision of what the world could be like in a way that it really wasn't in 2004. And people had this dream, this paradigm of what might happen. They were like, all right, we're going to pair this like mobile computing. We're going to take the good things about computing and we're going to move them out into the world. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to take all your friends. We're going to take this thing that's the internet and we're going to put people on it. I mean, this is basically what Mark Zuckerberg decided to do. He said, we need people on the internet, and I'm going to take your offline social networks and we're going to connect them up with each other so that you know who your friends know and you can get all of this value out of that thing. I think it's pretty awesome. I mean, I think this is one of the rare times where, 10, 15 years ago, people started to envision this world. You know, my second job, or my first job actually out of college was with a hedge fund. Feel free to boo. I was only able to stick in there for about 4 months. But at the time, everyone was talking about 3G, this was 2004 again. And people were just so excited about what the mobile future might look like. And in fact, we actually got that future. Like, we got the jetpack this time, right? I mean, we have these phones in our pockets that are more powerful than computers that can do things that like we hadn't really ever thought of. I mean, in my story called The Jig is Up on the Atlantic, I mean, this was like the thing that just blew my mind. I was just thinking, I was like, I can take a photo of a check and deposit it in my bank account, turn around and find a new book on Twitter and buy it, and then I could be doing that in Afghanistan while I have like a drone flying overhead and I'm keeping track of how many steps I'm walking with like a Fitbit. I mean, this is a crazy world, and none of those things really were possible 8 years ago, or even 5 years ago. I mean, if you think about that, 2007, that's when the iPhone launched, that's when the Kindle launched. We didn't have these things before. So I think the question for me is, now what, right? I think a lot of people are still thinking about the world in terms of wanting to found new mobile social ventures, right? We see all these people out there saying, like, there's an ecosystem, and we want to be a part of it. There's, like, all these wonderful things going on with Facebook, with Google, and we want to play some role in this thing, connecting people up and being in their pockets. And I think, I kind of think that's over. if we think about what people are really doing now with a lot of startups, here's a quote from Jeff Hammerbacher, old friend of mine, from Business Week: "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." I mean, that's really what a lot of the business is right now. It's people taking vast amounts of data, plowing them through machine learning algorithms so that they can get someone to, be 0.1% more likely to click on something than they would have before. And meanwhile, what you and I can do as consumers, we can pretty much do now what we could do a couple years ago. And I don't think that there's a fresh paradigm for what it is that we should be doing next. That vision that people had 8 years ago that was just so broad-reaching and so ambitious, like, what is the equivalent now? I'm not sure that we really have that for the consumer internet. There's all kinds of great ideas out there, but I don't think that people are really executing on what the next big thing could be. So I'm a journalist, right? I mean, I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly the path of technology forward. But I do think that I can, I follow this business pretty closely, and I know a lot of the people who are working on startups, who are funding startups. And so I kind of want to offer two solutions going forward to sort of what's next. And one's going to be about money, and the other's going to be about culture and people. So the current model, right, is kind of viral, right? We even call it that, it's viral. But what that really means is, how do viruses work, right? They have to sort of take over, they have to reproduce, they have to grow, and then they have to infect a bunch of other people because they can't grow on their own, right? They're sort of like, I was going to put a big zombie photo up here. But then, when you blow a zombie photo up that big, it's really disgusting. So these are just like viruses that infect people, right? And I really think that's kind of what this model of giving things away for free makes you do. You have to grow fast. And there's a problem with growing fast. This chart, I feel like, really sums it up nicely. It's very complicated, as you can tell. I mean, if you're making a free web service, you're making these free mobile services, as you grow, you're losing more money. If you're getting paid for it, you're making a lot more money. And the problem with losing a lot of money is that then you have to sell, or you have to do something, or you have to go out of business. And so I think there's just the gravity of the free model right now is pushing people towards making a lot of the same kind of products that fundamentally are just about growing themselves. That's to say nothing of the sort of other sort of privacy surveillance problems with this. I mean, I don't really have time to go into all the details, but a lot of the work that we've been doing on The Atlantic has been about thinking through privacy in this socially connected world. And one of the big things that we learn is that basically your privacy is your friend's privacy and vice versa. On Facebook, on Twitter, all these things, the more that you give away of your data, the more that marketers can know about your friends. Which is a really interesting thing, because it's sort of like saying, well, instead of paying $2 for this thing that I already want to use, I'm going to tell marketers about my friends. That's a really bizarre thing to do in the real world, and I think that we're increasingly going to see it as a bizarre thing to do on the internet. So these look like viruses, but they're not. They're gut bacteria. And gut bacteria are this really healthy thing that are amazingly good for people. In fact, you couldn't live without them. They help you do your digestion. So I think this is the sort of model that we should be looking at, right? These gut bacteria live off our resources. They live off human beings' food, right? And you pay them a little bit for the services that they render to you. And I really think this is kind of more the model, this healthy symbiosis, as opposed to the viral model where everything has to grow at breakneck speed or it dies. The more interesting thing that I think could really change, when we think about what happened during this last 8 years, since 2004, since I was running through that field, the apps did a lot. The apps conquered consumers. I mean, so many people have mobile and social apps. Obviously, Facebook coming up on 1 billion users. We're talking about billions of mobile phones. But the startup culture is really what conquered all the producers. For a while, people like to associate startup culture with Silicon Valley, right? I mean, that is the idea, right? That there are all these great things about startup culture. There's Nerf guns, and there's hoodies, and there's, that you don't have to go to work like a company man in a gray suit, and all those things, right? You can wear blue jeans and a blazer, which seems to be also something of an embarrassing uniform for this culture. And I think that that's the thing that's going to change if we want to see the next generation of apps. So my wife and I, who's sitting here actually in the front row, went on this trip shortly before we got married for the Atlantic. We drove around the American South, starting up in DC, and kind of taking this trip that you see here and finally ending in New Orleans. And really what we saw was that in all of these places, I mean Charlotte and Knoxville and Chattanooga and people have learned that not just that they can sort of make things in these areas, but that there's a certain culture that they can buy into. I mean, the humidity was different. The food was kind of porkier. But other than that, like, we sort of knew the vibe of these people that we were meeting. Like these guys in Richmond who helped Tumblr out with their mobile app. And like these college soccer buddies in Chattanooga who are building a fitness app. And this guy who's working on creative finance in New Orleans. And these guys who were building a first-person shooter in Durham. And you've seen that the word is out among local development officers and people who run cities and people who run regions that like the way to create jobs, the way to like push your economy forward is to actually bring in startup infrastructure. So there's incubators all over the place. There's accelerators all over the place. There's money available of grants of people who can help you get your business off the ground. All of which is great to a certain extent. And all of which sort of can be traced back to sexy Bill Gates. That is such a good photo. That's the whole reason I don't actually have much to say about this. Aside from, there is this idea in startup culture, I think, about the whiz kid. And, you know, Bill Gates, like Steve Jobs, you know, got his start very early, built these very successful computer companies, like Mark Zuckerberg, he dropped out of Harvard. And I think starting in the 1980s, you started to see these people have this idea that startup kids were these like young white guys who kind of looked like Bill Gates and were like pretty good at programming and like had this particular kind of culture. What's interesting is you look at these people here. I mean, just, you know, Google and Groupon and Tumblr and Instagram and Quora. That guy's actually a good friend, so I feel sort of bad having him on here. These are like the Twitter guys, and there's Pinterest, right? Anyone notice anything about these guys and all the other guys that we've had? These are like roughly some of the most successful startups in the world have built all of this value and all these things, and every single one of them is like a young white guy. I mean, nothing wrong with young white guys. Some of my best friends are young white guys. I am half young white guy. But there's kind of a problem here, no? And I think that for a long time, diversity in Silicon Valley has been treated as something that's kind of nice, right? People are like, oh, well, you know, we're a meritocracy, like we do the best we can to hire like women and older people and minorities, et cetera. But really, like, you know, we hire the best in these sorts of things, right? My colleague at the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, has a really great line, though. He says, like, you know, he was talking about racism specifically, but I think it applies to like all the isms, right? It's not just about like hating people of a different race. That's not what these things are about. It's about being really skeptical of some people and being really willing to believe in some other people. And I think a lot of people were really willing to believe in these people, and I'm not sure that the same people who backed them would be as willing to believe in some other people. I mean, just look at the stats. I think the latest study I saw was that 6% of VC-backed startups are founded by women. The numbers are equally bad with other minority groups. And I think it's no longer, particularly as we're sitting here at this moment, where we've had this generation of people build this thing with this particular kind of hoodie startup culture, and we're trying to find something new. I mean, I think this is really the question that we should be asking ourselves. I mean, what kind of innovation ecosystem can support all this like brilliant innovation that we've seen by these people, but that can also bring other people into that party? Like, where are we going to see, and how are we going to see people, you know, older people, women who, you know, also, I would also like to note, I mean, it's not just the actual types of people. I mean, if you look at gender or sexuality in the startup world, you know, you've heard about brogrammers, you've heard about the kind of frat culture that exists in a lot of startups. I don't think those things are conducive to hiring a lot of people with any kind of alternative lifestyle at all, right? This is a culture that's like very suburban, that's like very Palo Alto, if you will. And I think we need to get past that particular idea of what it is to be a startup. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time that I had heard a venture capitalist or an angel investor or someone involved in startups say, I really like startups because, and Silicon Valley, because we work on the hardest problems. We go out there and we find like the toughest things and we solve those problems for people. I want to look at them like, really? Then why do we have like thousands of apps that cater to 24-year-old white guys? I think the reason is, of course, that like if the model is to take 5 kids just out of college and say, hey, go build something fun that all of your friends will join and that will grow like Facebook did at Harvard and then at every other school in the country, then you're going to get exactly that kind of app. And so I think really what it comes down to is thinking about founding teams. We have a guy named Kanye Macabella who writes for The Atlantic sometimes, made a really passionate plea for this, and that for certain types of problems, you need to have founders who understand those problems. And if you look at the sort of things that are really in trouble in the United States, if you look at like the sort of destruction of local education systems because of problems with their financing models, if you look at people who've lost their homes and foreclosures, if you look at people who just aren't sure how their kids are going to live a better life than they are, like those people are not, generally speaking, on the founding teams of startups. Those people are not believed in by the very people that believed in all those other guys. And so I think the call to action here, the challenge, is to actually do something different for once about hiring other people, about bringing other people onto your founding teams. Because I don't think in this next iteration, diversity is going to be something that's just nice. I think it's going to be something that's necessary. So that's my challenge to you all. Thank you very much.